Hello and welcome all to the Cambridge Public Library. We're so delighted to have you here in person. It's my pleasure to introduce Paula Phipps, the Associate Director of Bio for a Livable Climate, who's passionate about raising awareness of the enormity and immediacy of the threat of climate disruption and its effects. Without further ado, here's Paula Phipps.
Thank you, Emily. That was Emily St. Germain, who is the host of a STEAM program here in the library, as well as other programming, and has hosted one of our events in the STEAM program pre-pandemic. It's been a while since we've been here. So I'm very pleased to be here and to introduce our speaker and our conversationalist today. Hannah Lewis is the editor of Bio for Climate's Compendium of Scientific and Practical Findings Advancing Eco-Restoration as a Way to Address Global Warming. Very big title, and I may not have each word correct, but close enough. Hannah has been editor of the compendium for 5 years now, and has created 2 issues a year. We're about to have the 11th issue in process, and this review is a remarkable resource for researchers, scientists, the general public, students who want to know what's going on in a whole range of ecosystems as far as restoration is concerned. Hannah went to Middlebury College as an undergraduate and has a degree, I believe, in sustainable, I'm terrible at this kind of thing, in sustainable, I will read this part right here.
Middlebury Environmental Studies.
Environmental Studies from Middlebury, and a master's degree in sustainable agriculture and sociology from Iowa State University. And she has worked in various roles related to building sustainable food systems. She's from Minneapolis. She knows the Midwest well. And she came to Bio for Climate right off as a compendium writer. Adam Sachs, who was in the audience, had written the first issue of the compendium, and Hannah took over after that and has done a remarkable job bringing together resources from all kinds of journals across the spectrum: engineering, ecosystem restoration, anything in any of the various siloed areas that promotes the idea of addressing global warming, climate change, through restoring ecosystems. And she will be joined in conversation after her presentation by Maya Dutta, who is our manager of regenerative projects at Bio for Climate, and was the project manager for the Miyawaki forest that we created, built, co-built in Cambridge last September. So Maya has a degree in mathematics and has an incredibly well-organized mind and way of operating, and was able to bring together over 100 volunteers for the forest planting, and originally came to us concerned about the very depressing state that the planet was in, and wanting to help do something about it, and certainly found her niche at Bio for Climate. So, welcome both of them, and thank you very much for coming, and we expect to have a very robust question and answer period after they speak. Thanks.
Colin mentioned, I work for been with the group for 5-6 years, and it was Biodiversity Climate who opened my eyes to the relationship between ecosystems and climate change and the things that we can do to mitigate and adapt to climate change that are nature-based. So yeah, definitely got headed on the path towards this book just by being surrounded by the great Biodiversity Climate people. So, okay, so let's see. Well, I'm going to start the presentation with a question about the title. So, why mini forest revolution? And by the way, is my voice okay? Okay.
Yes.
So I thought we could just dissect the title, and that's a good way to kind of get into the ideas of the book. So starting out with mini forest and forest. What is a forest? There are lots of ways to think of a forest. You could think of a bunch of pine trees growing together in lines that looks a bit like a forest from a distance, but actually it's growing there to be harvested. But the kind of forest we're talking about here is a forest in an ecological sense. So it's a biological community dominated by trees with many plants and animals and microorganisms interacting with each other and with the environment as a functional unit, as a community. So then, what is a mini forest? Well, it's a bit bleached out. I think it's because somehow this translated as black and white. So a mini forest is, or a tiny forest is literally a small version of the type of forest we just saw and we're talking about. But there's something really special about it, which is it's planted by us. And it's planted in the small spaces around where we live and work, roadsides, schoolyards, churchyards, riverbanks, and so these pictures are from Cameroon, where on the left, lower left, you have a mini forest site by a river. And actually, it's more than, it's a little stream, but actually it's also a water catchment for the community there. And so you can see the little box on the, blue box on the left, and that is where people draw drinking water for the community. And for many years, it's actually a very rainy area. It's in the Congo rainforest basin. So it gets plenty of water, but a lot of development has happened quickly, and so there's a lot of hard surfaces, a lot of the forest has been lost, and the water table is falling. And so the woman who led this project, Limbi Blessing Tata, she discovered that planting trees, planting a forest might be a way to get the land there to be more absorbent and to improve the quality and quantity of water. So she led a planting project in here in March of 2020, and I'm sorry that you can't see this better, but it's the same bend in the river, and I think you can see at least that there's lots of vegetation here that's just bare. But it's a year and a half later, so it's covered in vegetation after 1.5 years. Tall, thick vegetation. So, and so up on the upper right is the local community that planted it. And the size that they planted, it's pretty much everything you can see in that left part that doesn't already have plants on it is what they planted. So it's well, roughly the size of a tennis court is typically how the size of the mini forest that people are planting, and they're planting about 600 plants in that space of the size of the tennis court. So now we talked about mini forest, what that is, and the second part of the title is revolution. And to me that has two significances. And the first one is in terms of the paradigm shift. So this here is a quote from Akira Miyawaki, who who's sort of at the heart of the mini forest idea, and Elgene Box, who's an American ecologist, and they wrote Healing Power of Forests. So they said, the process of restoring green environments to residential and industrial neighborhoods, as well as to spaces in and around transportation and other public facilities, cannot be limited to mere decoration. And so the idea is that oftentimes, so that when you're planting a mini forest as sort of a landscaping approach, your main goal is not decoration or ornamentation, like a beautiful flower bed maybe, but it's restoring ecosystems and connecting people to nature. Those are pretty explicit goals of the mini forest idea. And so when ecosystem restoration is your goal, is your landscaping goal, then the visual outcome is different. And so on the left, we have more traditional tree plantings where on the top left, it's in Japan, it's just cedar trees. It's just one species planted rather spaciously in a line. And then on the bottom, it's the same idea, just a single species of trees planted along a street. And then on the right, you can see these are mini forests. On the top right, it is in Japan, and on the bottom right, it's in Indiana in the US. And to my eyes, the vegetation in these pictures looks like it wasn't even necessarily planted, like it grew there on its own. It looks really natural. And so the difference then is that when you plant a mini forest, you're planting the trees in relation to one another, and in sort of in the context of a forest community, as opposed to planting trees as individuals, where you're just planting a tree and that's great, but here you're planting trees as part of a community, and so you're planting a diverse mixture as well. And then the other sense of the word revolution is how quickly it's taken off around the world, just in the past 5 years or so. And so what I wanted to capture in the book was just a lot of those stories from all around the world, every continent except I haven't heard of anything in Antarctica, but every other one. And so I had the pleasure of talking to people from the Netherlands, Cameroon, Lebanon, England, India, France, Iran, Japan, China, the US for the book, and I tell their mini forest stories in the book. But the ones that, and all of them, well, except in Japan, they're all roughly within the past 5 to 10 years getting going. In Japan it's much longer, and we'll get into that later. But this was just a small sample of the many projects there are all around the world right now. So I've been talking about mini forests, and the basis for planting a mini forest is the Miyawaki Method. And I'll introduce Dr. Miyawaki in a couple minutes, but his method has a few key variables. So species composition, we're planting native climax forest species, and I'll explain that word climax in a minute too. And then we're planting with the structure of a natural forest in mind, so not just tall canopy trees, but also smaller trees and shrubs to make up the layers of a natural forest. And then in most places where we do these, we're starting from rather degraded ground. So improving the soil so that it's a loose, living soil that is kind of similar to what you would find in a mature forest. That's what we're trying to recreate when we get started. And then density, as I mentioned before, we're planting a lot of plants in a small area, so it's like typically about 3 plants, trees and shrubs per square yard. And then we're mulching heavily to protect the soil in the beginning, because the plants, when we put them in, they're only about that tall. They're small. They don't really create much shade yet. And so we want to protect the soil and also suppress the weed growth. And so the mulch layer is often quite thick. And so those are the basic ideas. So I mentioned climax species, and then the Miyawaki method is based on the idea of natural ecological succession. So in this timeline, it's about a 100+ year timeline, and on the left you have bare soil, and on the right you have a climax forest. And so what happens, and this is something that I think is really familiar to us, we've all seen the process of succession kind of at like some stage. Because first, when you have bare ground, you start to see dandelions, some weeds, some grasses, clover, little smaller plants that live short lives, grow fast, cover the ground. But over time, you get larger and larger plants taking over, and they're larger, longer living, and as you get closer and closer towards the the climax stage, they're increasingly more shade tolerant. And so by the time you get to this shade tolerant climax forest, you've created a pretty stable community of plants, a stable composition, because most of the earlier successional plants need sun to germinate and grow. And there's no sun once you get this full forest, so you're selecting for just shade-tolerant species that will be able to survive in the shade until they get a chance to, until they get a bit of light. You know, if one of the older trees falls, and then they can grow up, but they can survive, they can hold on for a long time in the shade, whereas the earlier successional plants can't. And so with the Miyawaki method, we're speeding up the process actually simply by skipping over a large part of the process. So we start from bare degraded ground, and then instead of waiting for all that time, we just go straight to the climax species. We plant those directly. But what happened during that sort of middle period is that the plants that were growing there were improving the soil. They were improving the organic material, the humidity, the structure. And so since we're starting from bare ground, we need to do the work that those earlier successional plants would have done. So that's why we have to prepare the land ourselves. So Elgin Box, again, who was a colleague of Miyawaki, he explained, the logic of Miyawaki's method is to create a permanent canopy of climax species directly without going through the successional stages. This creates a more humid, shady forest microclimate as quickly as possible. And so really what we're doing is creating really the ideal conditions for those climax species to grow into. We're creating the soil that you would find in a mature forest. But then we're not making them survive in the shade. We're actually giving them direct sunlight, so it'll be as if, you know, there had been a clearing in the forest and you've got all these little saplings and they just shoot right up because they grow better in the direct sun, even though they can survive in the shade. One of the great pleasures of writing the book was getting to know who Dr. Akira Miyawaki was, and I didn't get to talk to him. He passed away last summer after 3 or 4 years of illness. But I got to talk to some of the people who knew him, and then he also wrote a lot and he spoke a lot too. So I just really took in tons of his words through reading and listening. And so he was a botanist, plant ecologist. He studied weeds as a graduate student. And then over the course of his 50-year career, he planted forests in nearly 3,000 places, mainly in Japan, but in other parts of the world as too, I think 18 or 19 countries. And then he was awarded the Blue Planet Prize for Global Environmental Leadership in 2016. And so if those numbers speak to his level of engagement in the world. Like 3,000 forests in 3,000 places, and he was physically involved in most or all of those. And so, but just to sort of underline, just to hear just some of his words, he wrote in his Blue Planet Prize speech, he wrote, "Let us go out and create real forests based on potential natural vegetation, not waiting for tomorrow, but starting now from where we are standing and spreading outward to the whole world. I myself am resolved to continue to plant trees, starting from where I am and spreading to the whole world, so long as I have life left in my body." And he definitely did just that. Case in point, he's here on the right with his sort of signature straw hat and blue rain jacket. And this was in 2014, I believe. He was 86 here, and he was leading a planting festival of 400 people in Madison, Indiana, at an auto car manufacturing facility. And so it was workers, their families, and the local community. And what I like about this picture, this story, is that it's a good example of the type of projects he led. So I've been talking about mini forests that are the size of a tennis court, but Miyawaki himself, when he was leading all of these 3,000 forest projects everywhere, he led really big planting festivals with hundreds of people, and always trying to include as many community members as possible. School kids were often involved, universities, and he worked with municipalities, universities, schools, but he also worked a lot with Japanese industrial companies. And so it was by way of his collaboration with a Japanese car manufacturer, that he came to Indiana to do this forest planting. And that really helped take him all over the world, was the collaboration with Japanese companies that had international operations. And one other thing so he made a big point to involve lots of people in the planting, to get people with their hands in the dirt, but he also wanted them to understand what they were planting, and so he always did a naming ceremony. So somebody in the group would call out the names of the tree species that they were about to plant, the main tree species. For instance, if oak was part of the overstory, a particular species of oak, and they would name a few of those main species, and then everyone in the group would repeat the name 3 times. And so it was to get people to become familiar with the names of the native trees that were growing in their area, that were native to their area, and to know what was in this forest, and start to be able to recognize it too. So Miyawaki was doing all that, and in 2009 he went with Toyota he led a planting festival at a Toyota facility in Bangalore, India, and was very fortunate that one of the engineers working at that facility was somebody named Shubhendu Sharma, and he's the one in the hat in the middle there. This isn't at the Bangalore event, but Shubhendu volunteered to help plant at that event, and he was just fascinated, actually, from an engineer's standpoint, it sort of fascinated him how you could assemble the component parts of a natural forest, you know, not just trees, but they're tall trees, but there were many parts of a forest, many, many species, a special, you know, a special quality of the soil, and then multiple layers of the forest. So it intrigued him, and so he, you know, he started doing research on forests. He planted a forest in his backyard, and eventually he decided to leave his job and start a company called A Forest. And the reason, he said, when we were talking, he said, well, this is just something everybody should know. The Miyawaki Method is something everyone should know. I am an engineer. I know how to write standard operating procedures, so I'm going to try to make this way of planting a forest open access. I want to do it myself, you know, as a company, but I also want to make it available to anybody, anywhere. And so, as part of that, he gave a TED Talk in 2014, and it really took off. It had more than 1 million views, and it sparked the mini forest movement that I got to learn about in the process of writing the book. And I think like a whole new wave of forest makers first saw Shubhendu's talk and then started to learn about it and got initiatives going in their communities or in their countries. And so one of the people that Shubhendu inspired and taught was a Beirut, Lebanon architect named Dutta. And Dutta had been bothered for a long time by the Beirut River, which is similar to the LA River and some other rivers around the world that were just paved. They were just paved. And the idea was you know, as soon as the floodplain started to get developed, they didn't want it to flood, and so they had to get, you know, water out of town as quickly as possible. And to Adib, that was the death of the river, because then you could start seeing trash, industrial waste, you know, dead animals in there. So it was more like a sewer than a river at that point. So he had been thinking, how do we deal with this? How do we mitigate this problem of a dead river for our city? And so he heard Shubhendu's talk, and it inspired him, and he got Shubhendu to come and lead a workshop. And so they planted what's now 2,200 square meters. So it's basically this whole area you can see here. This was their original, they did it in about 3 sections. So they did this first. And then these are eucalyptus trees, which are invasive, and they're also really take a lot of water. And so they took down the eucalyptus and then finished planting all of this area. So all of that is now a native forest for the Lebanon area, the Beirut area. And so after the first part of that little forest had been planted, in 2020 there was an accidental nitrate explosion in the port of Beirut that killed about 250 people, injured thousands of people, and left hundreds of thousands without their home or their business. So it was really a traumatizing event for the people there. And so a year later, Adib organized a memorial planting. So with some of the families that had lost loved ones in the explosion, they planted this forest, and these are little pieces of handmade paper with the name of somebody who died in the explosion. And so for each person, they planted a tree, and now it's those families that lost a loved one, and also some kids, local kids who are taking care of the forest right now as it gets established. And so they're also working with schools on the left, and also starting with the schools that were most affected by the explosion. So on the left is a school, and you can see that the play area, the courtyard, is all concrete, except that they have done this just really small cutout. So this is like a microprint. It's only 48 plants in there, but it's still done according to many different native species, the multiple layers of a native forest, and so it'll be a little plush of vegetation in the middle of this otherwise concrete play space. And then this was another forest planted at a school in April, and just like a very narrow edge of forest, but in that same planting technique. And so I think, the idea, what Adib said about the memorial forest, because he too was injured in the blast, and what he said is that he was inspired. He thought that the Miyawaki method, the mini forest idea, had a greater role to play than simply healing the land. It was also something that we could do to heal ourselves and heal our communities. And so that was sort of what inspired the idea of the memorial forest and working with schools. And so he said, we can heal the land damaged by the explosion and urbanization while the land heals us through the act of planting. So anyway, I think it has a lot of powerful applications for a lot of different contexts. And in the book, I have a whole section on healing forests, where it seemed that the large part of the motivation for planting a mini forest with the community was healing from some sort of community trauma, not only the ecological aspect of it. So Maya. We have one more. Just briefly before I turn it over to Maya to talk about the Cambridge Forest, I just wanted to highlight the Tiny Forest program in the Netherlands, because it's a pretty cool example of how you can go from 0 to 100 in just 7 years. So they planted their first forest in December of 2015. And again, it was because the leader there, Dan Fleischrott, had heard Shubhendu Sharma's online talk, and it just clicked with something he wanted to do already. He felt that kids in the Netherlands, which is a very, very urbanized country where people don't have very much access to nature when they live in a metro area, and so he was thinking, how can we get kids connected with nature when we know that many of them may not have the means to go out and visit the beach, go out and visit the forest. So how can we bring nature to him? And then he heard Shubhendu's talk, and so it just clicked right into place for him. So so they did this first one in 2015, December. And by the end of this year, 2022, they will have planted mini forest with 230 schools around the country. 230 mini forests, tiny forests they call them. Each one in collaboration with a school, meaning that it's the kids that plant the forest, it's the kids that maintain it in the first few years as it's developing. And then they work with the teachers to do outdoor education based on the forest, and not just science, but literature and other kinds of things that the forest can be a sort of a learning tool. So now I'll pass it to Maya.
Thanks, Hannah, and thank you all again for being here, and to some of you for participating in this very project in Danehy Park in North Cambridge. So, as some of you know, this was actually the first Miyawaki forest in the Northeast United States, and this recent kind of new wave of mini forest revolution has touched many countries around the world, including the US. but we had yet to have one up here, despite our knowledge of climate change and its increasing impacts on extreme weather and on our communities, on temperatures, on water cycles, and on biodiversity. So we saw Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, saw the opportunity to implement this project as a way of trying this method out in our region, of increasing the space for biodiversity in our urban area, in our city, and directly engaging community members in taking an active and nurturing part of our ecosystem. We tend to think of our urban areas as a place that is away from nature and away from ecosystems, but this is a really healing act for understanding that humans don't have to interact that way and instead can start or jumpstart the process of restoring natural ecosystems. So I do want to talk a little bit about how we got to this beautiful project in North Cambridge. We had a lot of help, not just from community members, but a very active and interested city government that already saw planting trees as an important goal to tackle in building up climate resilience. So the reason we ended up in Danehy Park, which some of you also know as a former landfill that was turned into a park, a kind of restoration in its own right in that journey, was by working with colleagues in the city, in the Department of Public Works and Urban Forestry in particular, at finding a place around the city that would be kind of immediately available to jumpstart this project, but also could, be a place of gathering, be a place that people came to, that was near where people lived and went to school and lived their life, so that this could be a part of their world as well. So we planted in September of 2021 with, as Paula mentioned, over 100 volunteers came out to help be a part of that process on an absolutely beautiful fall day when it was supposed to thunder and rain, and instead we got sunshine and even a rainbow. And we were able to engage full families, kids, parents, grandparents, and get about 1,400 trees in the ground in a space of a little over 4,000 square feet. So this was certainly a project of creating this biodiverse community, and it was also made possible by a diverse community of different strengths and different resources. So we had the city and its equipment and its support in getting the site and preparing the site with the technical aspects of decompacting some of the soil, adding some really high quality soil amendments of compost and biochar, and supporting the efforts for shovels, gloves, all of the things that volunteers would need to be a part. We had, as well as kind of city-supported trees of a very biodiverse array, we had two local ecologists contribute trees to the planting. Russ Cohen, who's here today, contributed some plants, and Walter Kittredge contributed plants, both of whom were excited to take part in this prospect of bringing back a natural forest into a place where people could learn from the experience and grow and steward the trees. We also were gratified to have Ethan Bryson, a Sugi forest maker who works out in Washington, kind of lead us and guide us through the process of making a Miyawaki forest. We at Livable Climate have been engaged in promoting eco-restoration for a really long time, and we were really excited at this possibility of doing an example of restoration in our community. And it was really pivotal, too, to get the perspective of someone who had worked in forests around the country to bring together some of the knowledge of how the species list should be composed, how we should go about kind of the process of designing this multi-layered complex ecosystem for the specific site that we were at based on the analysis of that site and of the soil. So really a lot of people came together, and finally I want to say that Ethan also brought colleagues of his from the Yakima Nation in Washington and from the Navajo Nation down in New Mexico, who made connections to the Native American community here in the Mashpee Wampanoag to inform some of the species list and understand the ways that native species that have been used for food and medicine and have been a part of this kind of symbiotic community of life for years in this area could be restored to the land, could be planted, and in so doing kind of reconnect us to the species, to the life, to the ecosystems that have nourished us and kind of can continue to nurture our communities and future communities that live here. So we have a few photos here from planting day itself, putting trees in the ground, and a not very visible photo of 2 months out. But you can see a lot more photos online. I'm just going to include the websites for you all to look at and then show some more photos of the day. So on the top left, you can kind of see the before and after, the stark difference of on this hill that was kind of full of sod. We uncovered the soil, decompacted, added amendments, and then got to planting in this lovely circular structure. We did so with the help of so many people. Ethan is on the bottom left there, kind of demonstrating how the planting is done. I'm up there on the top right, and we have many of our wonderful volunteers, including some of the kids who came to Danehy Park for their soccer games and were just enchanted by the project. What are you doing? What is that? Can I try? You know, how is it done? And that sort of spirit was just absolutely infectious through the day. And so hearing the stories from Hannah of school forests and different communities taking this on just makes absolute sense, because if you engage a kid in something so tangible, so sensory, they just take to it and they start to develop their connection. And that's kind of one of the really encouraging things about doing this here in Danehy and beyond. So we also have a picture up on the top left of one of our shifts, one of our teams of volunteers, all of whom were really glad to be out there. I think the rainbow has kind of faded from view, but we were graced with the blessing of a rainbow. We were also graced with a literal blessing by Mary Lee Jones, who came out with Ethan from the Yakima Nation to kind of honor the process of restoration that is more than ecological. As Hannah said, is also kind of communal, can also be very spiritual in nature, because to reconnect to our water cycles, to our energy cycle, to the way that nutrients flow and carbon operates in our world, is also to reconnect ourselves to kind of the planet that we came from and our communities that we share it with, and the ways that we get food and nourishment and clean air and clean water. So it was a real honor to also acknowledge that and to understand that in our context, in kind of the land that we came from, there has been so much disconnection and so much severance of the original land stewards that we really need to start from a place of honesty when we engage in restoration. So I'll finally just share kind of a series of questions and possibilities raised by our project in Cambridge and by discussions with Hannah, with many other communities in the greater Boston area and beyond that we've talked to about Miyawaki forests and what they represent for engaging in climate action, for doing plantings in cities, for getting people involved in understanding this. And kind of top of the list is school forests, because as mentioned, you know, there's a lot of enthusiasm among children, and I think also a deep need for that ecological literacy, because you know, I grew up in a very dense urban environment, and so many other people have, and urbanization is kind of only continuing. A lot of us are very disconnected from the way that plants can nurture us, from what you can eat, what you can forage, what you can grow, and beyond that, a really ecological understanding of climate as well. That forests, for example, help buffer extreme temperatures, can make areas cooler, participate in the water cycle. All of these things are possible to teach through doing, through planting a forest and through integrating with the curriculum around forestry, around ecology, and around climate and science more broadly, which is, a great loss at this point, but also a great potential if we start to address it. We also have talked about the possibility of biodiversity corridors, much like cooling corridors, in which cities can kind of strategically deploy Miyawaki forests and other types of native plantings to encourage biodiversity to hold on and rejuvenate in many places where the way that we've built up our environment, paved over surfaces, deforested and removed habitat have really driven some species to the brink. However, in many stories of ecological restoration around the world, including in Miyawaki forest type of restoration, we see those species come back. We see birds come back, and just the joy of being able to witness that resurgence is very profound, and it also, is extremely important to the way that we live, the pollinators that we rely on for our food systems, and these greater ecological webs that we have a role in. We've also talked a lot about the potential for combating environmental injustice, talking about high temperatures, air pollution, extreme heat, extreme kind of climate extremes in flooding and stormwater. These tend to be aggregated in redline communities, marginalized communities, racial and economic minorities, certainly here in Cambridge and kind of around the country and frankly around the world. And because Miyawaki forests start so small, 1,000 square feet, a tennis court, a few parking spaces, we can decide, we can make the choice to prioritize those neighborhoods where there's very little tree cover. And Cambridge has a very ambitious urban forestry master plan that has outlined kind of the disparities. And so we can start to use those things as a roadmap of, as we're rewilding, where should we start and what should we look at? And I think that's a really strong way of, again, kind of reconnecting and restoring more than just ecologically, but also kind of communally and socially. We've also been exploring, talking to folks from hospitals and health centers, how important green space, trees, and biology and biodiversity is to human health, to both physical and mental health. And there have been studies showing that seeing a tree from your hospital window actually, those who are able to see that green space, to see that biodiversity, recover faster. And there is this real tangible importance to having that greening, having that biodiversity. And so that's kind of another potential for collaboration, as well as the collaboration with research institutions. We are talking in the Cambridge Forest, in Danehy Park, about doing some biodiversity monitoring. We've got folks from Lesley University who are really interested in getting students out there for research projects, and then also beyond, a graduate research level or an undergrad level, there's also the possibility for citizen science. So, you and I going out with our phone cameras, understanding kind of the insects that we're looking at, the trees that we're looking at, and just monitoring and deciding to kind of be a part and take on both that stewardship and the learning process is a really big opportunity. And here in Cambridge, in Boston, across this area, we have so many schools, so many campuses, so many students, and so many interested and engaged people that we can get going in deploying these projects. And to kind of take it to a more challenging note, some people have asked, if this is so great, why don't we see it everywhere? And that's kind of a fair question, which is, how do we scale this in order to address our many kind of climate challenges, while also, making sure that this is still effective. And that's kind of the first thing off of the bat is, understanding the Miyawaki Method and why it's important, how it's done, really keeping faithful to the biodiversity, the density, the native species, and the organic methodology, rather than kind of adopting certain parts of it, but letting go of others. So in order to make this work, we need to understand the method and then also the ecologies that we're operating in. So most often, I think, in handbooks and things, it starts with a survey. It starts up what existed here, what was the climax community, what is suitable to be planting, and these things are definitely things that people can engage in and start to learn about and do in a scaled way, but we need to increase the literacy and increase kind of the knowledge of this. And it was only a couple years ago that even Hannah learned of it, wrote her article in The Guardian, informed us at Biodiversity Climate about it. So that's really the first step. Before action is awareness. We also need to meet the need for native trees, and a lot of our landscaping and gardening culture has kind of not prioritized native plantings and pollinator-friendly plantings, but that's certainly changing. And so in this movement, we need to make sure we have enough trees for the kind of wildly increasing, wonderful appetite for Miyawaki forests that we're seeing around. There's also ongoing stewardship, as Hannah mentioned. The first 3 years or so, we have a little bit of weed removal and a bit of watering to do. So to get communities engaged with that, not as I've planted this and I'm done and I'm going to walk away, but instead, this is a part of my community and I'm going to continue to come back to it, to learn from it, to engage with it. And that is something that, again, I think there's a lot of appetite for that slower and more ongoing, more deeply appreciative relationship. And I think finally that kind of appreciation for wild spaces and biodiversity is also sort of changing, but was not always the norm. It does look a little bit more chaotic to have a mini forest than a sculptured garden. So this is something that I think people are starting to realize as they know more about biodiversity, that that's an attractive thing, that that's something they're interested in. But certainly for developers to take this on, they have to be okay with some of that wildness and letting that be a part of the way we interact with space. And finally, I do want to say that, and we've gotten a lot of questions before too, of how many Miyawaki forests does it take to replicate an existing forest, or to sequester as much carbon as 5 mature trees. And I don't think any of us are really promoting this method as a way of saying it's okay to take away mature trees, to deforest the Amazon, to deforest intact ecosystems. Instead, we're coming from a deep appreciation of those intact ecosystems and their functioning and their contribution to a livable global climate and regional climate, and trying to create more of that. So it's certainly not an either or, and instead we really want to do both and kind of take on that role of community stewards and an ecologically beneficial species. So I think I'll leave it there for the lessons from the forest, and we can get into conversation.
Well,
Take us out.
This last slide is, it's hard to resist the temptation to get started right where you are, which is exactly what I did when I first discovered the Miyawaki Method in 2019. And I was in France because my partner is in French, so we lived in a small town called Roscoff, where I proposed a mini forest, worked with a local environmental organization. We proposed a mini forest to the town, and after they kind of understood what we were talking about and why, etc., they agreed and they offered us some land, and we reached out to the schools. We planted with the schools. My daughter is the one in red on the upper right. And so anyway, that's part of the story in the book, and it's part of my whole adventure with the Miyawaki Method and writing the book. But anyway, I guess I think the main message that I really hope to share is kind of exactly like what Miyawaki said, which is that you can start where you are. I mean, my home happened to be in France at that time, but I was able to find other people with a fire in their belly to heal the land. I was able to find partners. I was able to find the local people who are knowledgeable about the local ecology there. They became part of the team. And through the process of doing that, we had to explain why we're doing this. And so since it's kind of a novel thing, the fact that you have to explain it means that you engage in conversations that you wouldn't otherwise have had. So we showed a really wonderful movie to the kids about forest ecosystems, and it was a film that was at their level, but also adults' level. Like, it was really wonderful. But anyway, it gave us a reason to have a conversation about why forest ecosystems, what they are, and why they matter. So, so I guess that's it. That you can really start right where you are, and first thing you do is form a team, and that team is really important because you need to get the diversity of skills and interests and knowledge into that project. That's our presentation. And I want to share a really wonderful tagline that Adam proposed. I guess we don't need it. That's particularly appropriate for the Boston-Cambridge area. Make way for saplings.
So thanks, Anna. I had so many questions listening to you, and so I guess I'll start. We'll have questions from the audience as well, so I won't do too many because I know we started a little bit late. So I'll make way for other saplings here. But first, I guess I wanted to run through kind of some of the technical FAQs, the things that people tend to raise when they first hear this, because a lot of people are, coming to this idea for the first time, and they're unfamiliar with, especially the density. So I think the questions that I get most often are, how can we manage, like, how is a forest like this successful? What's its water use like? What's its, like, how does the density work for all of these trees to grow? And how, essentially, do they work past those 3 years, past those 5 years? And what can we do to actually make sure this is successful and not just, the newest fad in tree planting?
Well, so the density, one thing that's important to remember is that we're not just using horizontal space, we're using the vertical space too. So we're not only planting one size of tree that's going to bump into each other at the level where it branches out. We're planting the shrubs, the smaller trees, and the larger trees. And so that's one thing. The survival rate in the first year is supposed to be 90%. But then after 5 years or more, then it drops to 60-70%. So so you're going to have this sort of competition. That the density stimulates this competition among the trees to get to the sun. And if you think about a clearing in a forest, so you think about a giant oak tree in a forest, and it's dropped all of its acorns, tons of acorns, and so they're germinating down there kind of close to each other, and they're just hanging out waiting for some sunlight to let them grow taller. And once you have that, then it's like a race to be the one that gets up and to fill the canopy again. So, but in the case of this, we're not planting only oaks, we're planting a lot of other trees too. So they'll sort of sort themselves out in the layers, and in terms of, some will become stronger and the other ones will fade away. But so that's but the advantage of doing it is in terms of moisture. Is kind of like what L.G. Bach said, that quote there, that your goal is to create a microclimate within, and so you create that canopy, and it's like a forest is a little bit like a building, because you've got the canopy, which is the roof, you've got the mantle, which are the walls, and those are the more the ones that need sun, that are kind of around the edges, and then you've got the layers, so those are kind of the different levels of the building. So it's enclosed, and so like our houses create a microclimate for us. It's a different thing, but it's enclosed in a sense. So it's keeping heat and dryness and wind out of that, and then of course you've got the soil, which is now really improved because it's alive and it's porous, and so when the rain falls, then it can soak in. So you're holding humidity, you're capturing humidity because of the soil, because the soil is able to absorb the water, and then you're holding it in that microclimate. So that's how it becomes self-sufficient after 3 years is because and it's also shading out the weeds. So you don't need to water it because it's holding its own moisture.
That's fantastic, thank you. I thought I'd like to preempt that in case people wanted to ask, and because it's important to have clear explanation for folks. Another question that I encounter often and somewhat struggle to deal with is the question of scale. People have asked, how many of these would you need to take on global climate change? Is this essentially enough of an action? And from the scale of local community to global climate, kind of where in there do you see the role of the Miyawaki forest and this kind of mini forest revolution, as you call it?
Yeah. Well, the thing that's cool about it is that when you're doing this one little tennis court size forest, the benefits are accruing locally, because you're learning about nature, you're cooling the area, you're enhancing the biodiversity. So there's already that. You're already helping that area adapt to climate change a little bit, and benefiting the local communities. And so that's already enough, But then the other thing is that I think in the forward, Paul Hawkins sort of calculates that, and I think he says if 1/5 of our degraded lands become mini forests, we would achieve the goal of turning all the carbon emitted into the atmosphere from 1800 until now. So that's just to kind of it's about a billion acres of mini forests, according to his calculation. So, but then also on a regional scale, I think you talked about wildlife corridors, and so Paris is a good example because they're dealing with more and more extreme heat, so they're trying to create an ecological network through the city where nobody is too far away from a cooling island or cooling corridor, and then they're sort of overlaying that with a network, wildlife corridors for the wildlife in the area. And so one idea they have a beltway around the city that has a grassy embankment, and so they're thinking about the grassy embankment as a place. They've already planted 2 mini forests there, but as sort of a natural corridor that can connect other areas. And so, so even if we do have large areas of conserved land, it won't be as healthy if it's isolated from other areas. So we can try to have those mini forests help create connectivity between the cities out to the wilder areas on either sides of the cities.
Yeah, no, I love that picture, and I think that integrated approach is maybe a good way to answer that question. I've learned from Jim Lurie about, all sorts of restoration, the importance of wetlands, of, other ecosystems besides forests. So hopefully this is one part of kind of a global climate action strategy.
Yeah, just one.
I guess I'll time check. Do we want to turn over to audience questions? Because I could hog up the rest of the evening, but I don't want to.
And should we pass this around? I guess we're fine.
Yeah, you're projecting. I'm going to grab the mic so that I can see.
Thanks. I wonder if there's a very long discussion, I should say first, but just wondering, is there any sort of metric about the efficiency of use of the sunlight? When I go into the woods in my town, it's all shaded, and it's just hard to visualize if there are 5 layers, 5 floors of your building. How much light actually gets down to the bottom, and is there more better utilized sunlight in Miyawaki forest than a traditional natural forest?
No, I mean, it's like the idea is to recreate that natural forest. So those species in the understory are only there because they tolerate the shade. Is that
It
what you're
does.
asking? Or?
So if that's the case, then is the Miyawaki forest better at converting sunlight into stored carbon than a natural forest, per acre?
No, well, not the Miyawaki method per se, but biodiversity, I would say. Like the interactions between all the different species in an ecosystem help make it more productive, so if you have a really healthy, productive system where, and so if you're thinking just on the plant level, if plants are growing well and densely and multiple layers, that's a lot more photosynthetic surface than an area that's sparser. And so every bit of photosynthetic surface is carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere and into the plants, into the soil, into the other organisms that are eating those things. And so yeah, it's not Miyawaki method per se, but any sort of biodiverse ecosystem where you stimulate interactions among the organisms and everything grows more healthy and more, so you have more carbon being absorbed and stored that way.
And if I could ask one more thing, I'm just curious about the long-term future of the Miyawaki forest. Is it going to maintain that biodiversity, or will, a century from now, will it be basically a succession and there'll be a couple of species left on the 500 to start with?
Well, no, the idea actually when Miyawaki says we're going to plant this forest here, this type of forest community has been here for many years. We're going to plant it today. It's going to last for another 9,000 years until the next ice age. That's what he says. And that's the idea, is that you're planting a community that's stable because it's got this stable composition of plants that are shade tolerant, and so it's going to persist and it's going to be resistant to stresses. But the idea is for it to last indefinitely in the absence of a disturbance that would hurt it in some way.
Yes, I have a comment and a question. So the comment is that the concept of a climax forest is somewhat familiar around here, because if you leave an area alone here, it's going to grow up in a forest. That's the basic pattern in the Northeast, but there's many areas on the Earth where that's not the ecological community, where you have natural prairies and savannas and stuff like that. So I imagine that it's a somewhat artificial construct to plant a Miyawaki forest in a place like that when it wouldn't actually naturally occur. I still understand the benefit of it, but but I just note that well, that's, makes sense here, it might be a bit of a head scratcher in some other landscapes.
Yeah, like if you look, a lot of the western U.S. is sagebrush scrub, and then there's the prairie, the tall grass prairie, the short grass prairie, and so, but still along riparian areas, you may have, it may be wooded. So if you lived in a place like that, maybe you would want to focus on restoring the riparian areas with the Miyawaki method. But no, it wouldn't be a good idea to replace some other wonderful ecosystem with a forest ecosystem.
Okay, thank you. And then the second comment is, of course, I think the intention is for animals to use these plants and to enjoy them, but I would imagine that some plants could be vulnerable to critter munching, to herbivory, and maybe that doesn't happen so much in the city where you're unlikely to have deer populations and stuff like that, but I'm wondering, in some of the areas where Miyawaki forests go in, is there a little bit too much nibbling by beavers or other things that might not understand the concept of what's being tried?
Well, the Cambridge forest has a fence around it protecting it. So, at least during the establishment period, while the plants are still young and vulnerable, they'll keep that up, but then ultimately probably take it down. But during the establishment period, they're in any place, like we did it too there, you can see the fence because they were worried about rabbits and deers. So hopefully those will come down eventually though, once the forest is in sort of fend for itself.
Russ, would you care to comment on your experience of one of the growers of some of the plants?
Sure. So to everyone, I contributed some plants to this project, and I have a nursery out in Weston where I'm growing over 1,000 plants, most of which I propagated from seed that I gathered myself. They're all native edible species, so it's very easy for me to fit in with the concept here. Contribute some plants. A lot of the sites where I'm doing planting, there are, I'm swapping out, let's say, invasive species, popping it out of the ground with a weed wrench and dropping in a native edible species in its place. So it's just one plant going in one place within an existing matrix of plants. So there I protect the individual plant, like with a half-inch mesh of hardware cloth, a cylinder that wrap it around the plant, and leave that in place until the plant's big enough to fend for itself. So, but I have seen a fair amount of critter munching, and also sometimes, when you plant by seed, when you actually put a seed in the ground, animals will dig up the seed to eat it. Like if you're planting a tree, a nut tree, the squirrels and chipmunks will eat the nuts even after the nuts have sprouted and the tree's begun to grow. If there's any nut left, they'll dig it up and eat it. So you have to protect those too. And what I say to myself is, if they only knew what I was doing and how their progeny would benefit so much by having all these nut trees around. But no, they're thinking short term, and we humans, we can relate to that because we all think short term.
Hey, Maya, I appreciate that you mentioned wetlands. I think about Hannah's from Minneapolis. And I walked all over Minneapolis one day and saw wetland after wetland after wetland and all kinds of vegetation around it. And I think the two work together. I think they can enhance each other. And I remember going down to the Mississippi River in St. Paul and seeing the otters. And I just thought, the idea that we start out with this idea of what a Miyawaki forest looks like, but ultimately we're trying to structure biodiversity, bring it back in its many, many forms, and it'll evolve in its kind of own way. I really appreciate all your work. Thank you.
Hi, great talk, really enjoyed it. I'm thinking about the approach to a Miyawaki forest and people's interaction with it. I'm thinking about when I'm most connected with forests, it's been when I'm inside them, surrounded by them on a path. And to me, this kind of seems like the inverse almost. were surrounding this almost object-like space that to me like seems so dense that you can't go into it. Is that not true? Like as people who have like seen them in person, I assume, can you go inside and if so, like do people build paths inside or benches or like other infrastructure?
Yes, that's a great question, thank you. So it just varies based on design, and you're absolutely right that, you know, the example I showed of the Cambridge Danehy Park forest is quite dense and kind of in this circle without a path, unfortunately. But we would really like to, and there are many examples in which kind of paths are built in, or even kind of gathering spaces. There have been some really lovely designs that aim to kind of incorporate that piece of how will people interact and it be a space for not just the vegetation. So it very much varies, but I think definitely that's something that we want to pursue here in Cambridge and in New Forest, is a place for people to really get inside and kind of reap those, you know, therapeutic benefits of being in the space and really connecting deeply to nature. So yeah, that's generally, there's not too much built infrastructure. I know paths and kind of, yeah, like an amphitheater-like space, but the possibilities are certainly there.
There was, you showed a picture of Mary Lee from the Yakama Nation doing the blessing of the Cambridge forest. And there on the Yakama Nation, they designed the forest in the shape of a medicine wheel. So it has like the 4 cardinal directions, and in the middle there's like a talking circle. So they have that space in the center, and it was actually planted at a correctional facility. So the idea is to bring the people who are residents there out with their caseworkers or in groups to have not only, you know, if they're working through some problems, some personal problems, that they have, you know, not only the discussion, but the sensory experience of being in a forest that helps them work through that. So I think that's a way to bond with the forest in that sense, being, like you were saying, a gathering space in the middle.
Quick question, just wondering about like the minimum size of a forest. Did you come across much information about that?
Well, the one I showed of the schoolyard in Beirut was only 48 plants. And so it really, I mean, using the word forest is really a stretch. But when we say forest, it's really referring to the vegetation structure and the species, not the footprint. So you know, you can theoretically make it as small as you like using that method, but it won't have a microclimate inside. It'll be more like the edge of a forest, and you'll have a hard time getting enough shade to keep out the sun-loving species, and it won't hold the water, the moisture as well as that sort of like building image does. So I think like a lot of people say 4 meters or 4 yards is like the narrowest that you would want to have it. To have like, you know, the feeling that they're, you know, that you can't see across it, and that you can start to create more of an interior space rather than just an edge, forest edge.
I have a question. I think I can talk up. The Miyawaki method is Japanese originally and was an urban adaptation of forests in these small scales, right? Is there any connection in that modern Japanese practice to the ancient practice of Shinto forest bathing? Have you seen examples of that?
Yeah, forest. Well, you mentioned Shinto forest. So, so the Miyawaki Miyawaki always, his big aha moment in coming up with the method was discovering the Shinto shrine forests, which are sacred forests, and they have never been cut. So cities built up around them, and they house the gods, and so you just leave them alone because they're the house of the gods. So, and so the vegetation there, he discovered it was different than the vegetation elsewhere in their cities and towns. And most of the vegetation elsewhere was planted, or it was secondary vegetation. So he discovered that idea of potential natural vegetation, and then sort of verified that, well, the Shinto forests are the potential natural vegetation of this area. So anytime he planted a forest, he would find a Shinto shrine nearby and survey the species in it, and then that's what they would replicate in the planting. Forest bathing, and I know that's a really cool concept that also has its roots in Japan.
I mean, it comes out of the other question earlier about the distance from the forest as an object, but also there's this deep connection in their culture to the design. But mostly their design is solid areas, except...
Yeah, they're definitely not meant to be gone into unless there's a path. So, but the paths can easily be made as part of the design, like Mike was saying. So, yeah. And they have also been planted in other areas, not only in cities. So, like the Great Wall of China has been working on reforestation, and so they did a project there. And Malaysia also. So, yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be in cities, but this mini forest idea, which was not Miyawaki's term. It was not his term. It was kind of a term that refers to this more like new wave, as I think of it. So they can be much, much bigger too, and they don't have to be in cities.
And you talked about protecting existing trees and old trees. Has there ever been a mini forest planted among existing, like old trees?
Yes, yeah. So if there is already a tree, and then I think I even remember a picture of like trees, and then they're planting a mini forest just kind of around it along the, so that's definitely, yeah. And then in Paris, they, in a suburb of Paris, they planted a mini forest. The organization there is called Bloom Forest, and there was a degraded woods in a suburb, and it was degraded because it was like a single species that had all been planted, and they were a species that doesn't live long. So anyway, it was kind of falling apart, but it was still a nice woods. But the town decided to help restore that woods by planting a mini forest in the middle. So not only does it reforest that clearing, it was a clearing already, but it also brings in all of these seeds. And so now those seeds can kind of disseminate out to the rest of the woods, and it'll be like a forest inoculation or something.
Yeah, I also just want to say that the sacred grove concept, which exists outside of Japan and many places in the world, I think is a really special concept because of that. It's this treasure trove of, housing the gods, housing the elders, housing the seedlings that can then repopulate other places, that can then kind of reconnect areas that have been severed. So if we can kind of learn from that example and also start to treat these new places with that sense of sacredness, we can really make some of that kind of shift within ourselves as well, that I think is part of this restoration. So thank you for bringing up that question, that topic.
Which is also a reminder that one of the things that our Native Americans guides and teachers who came from the Akira Nation made abundantly clear was that these are our relatives. They're quite clear that all living things, all species are our relatives, and trees or cultures for thousands of years, quite apart from sacred groves, have been considered sacred. And there was a time when a squirrel in one of the major forests in England could travel for hundreds and hundreds of miles, and the trees had never had to come down to the ground. And those folks actually considered damaging a tree to be an act of cruelty to a living thing, and it was severely punished. So, trees are us.
In a way, the scaling question, the cultural piece of this, and the kind of development of all the participants, in a way, is part of the scaling, it seems like, because there are 100 people who participate in this, and they spread out and they live their lives and they move away and they bring those ideas to other places and it informs their perspective. So in a sense, they spread out in a way that maybe the individual forest pieces don't. The other thing I observed is that forests, in my experience, I've been watching forests at the Cape develop and through normal succession. And there's sort of two parts to a forest. There's the part where it's so dense and young that it has no interior that you can enter. And then there's a sort of moment when it opens, when the shade or the canopy is high enough, and then suddenly there's spaces inside it. And it's very different. So years from now, these forests will have developed that structure, and suddenly they'll become a place that you can enter and experience, and that's the forest bathing way.
Well, I would just like to say that before you go, be sure to buy a copy of Hannah's book. She'll sign it for you, and 500 years from now, that book will be worth a whole lot. And story about the books we have for sale, there weren't enough at Portersburg Books who usually supply us with the books. So I ordered them from overnight shipping from Chelsea Green, and they arrived today just in time, and they gave us a 50% discount. So the books cost $179, and the shipping costs $220. So if we sell our books, we'll break even, and it will be a donation for a nonprofit. So you get a free book with every $20 donation, and I'm sure your grandchildren want them too. So they're available over at that table, and please come and buy a few.
So
was there anything else?
Okay, so I think we'll turn things over to book signing. Thank you so much, Maya. Thank you so much, Hannah. I'm sure that you've all been as amazed as I am